Drag her off this plane before she causes another scene. Captain Richard Halstead's command ripped through the first-class cabin with the kind of certainty that left no room for questions. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Even the low hum of the aircraft seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those words. Two airport security officers stepped into the aisle, their expressions professional but uneasy as they approached seat 1A. The woman sitting there never raised her voice. She never argued. She simply looked up with calm brown eyes that had seen this kind of judgment before. Dr. Camille Bennett wore a plain black sweater, dark jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a silver bracelet that caught the soft cabin lights whenever she folded her hands together. Nothing about her appearance matched the expensive assumptions people often attach to first class, and for Brooke Whitman, the lead flight attendant standing nearby with her arms crossed, that was all the evidence she believed she needed. "You were told this seat isn't yours," Brooke said loudly enough for every passenger nearby to hear. "You've delayed this flight long enough." Camille slowly held up her boarding pass one more time. "Seat 1A, she answered evenly. "The same seat I purchased." Brooke didn't even glance at it. "That document doesn't change the situation." A businessman across the aisle frowned. An older couple exchanged uncertain looks. Several phones quietly appeared above armrests, not recording yet, simply waiting to see what would happen next. Camille's phone rested on the armrest beside her. The screen suddenly lit up with an incoming call she did not answer. Instead, she gently turned it over, as though whatever was happening inside this airplane deserved her full attention. Halstead stepped closer. "Ma'am, this is your final opportunity. You can leave on your own, or security will escort you off." Camille looked directly at him. Her expression never changed. "Before anyone touches me," she said quietly, "I hope you understand exactly what decision you're making." Halstead's jaw tightened. "I'm making the decision that protects this airline." Camille gave the smallest nod, almost as if she had expected that answer all along. One of the security officers hesitated before speaking. "Ma'am, we're asking you to come with us." She stood slowly, not because she admitted she was wrong, but because dignity did not require a raised voice. As she stepped into the aisle, her silver bracelet slipped against her wrist, catching another flash of light. Brooke folded her arms with visible satisfaction while whispering to another crew member, "Finally." Camille glanced once toward the cabin, taking in every face watching the moment unfold. Fear wasn't reflected in hers. Disappointment was. Then the phone she had turned over began vibrating again. This time the call connected automatically through her wireless earbuds, and a composed female voice echoed softly enough for only those closest to hear. "Dr. Bennett," the voice said, "the board is assembled. Every director is on the line." Camille closed her eyes for a brief second before answering in the same calm tone she had used from the beginning. "Then don't disconnect." Captain Halstead frowned. Brooke looked confused. The nearest passengers exchanged puzzled glances. None of them understood why a board meeting would be listening to a woman they believed was being removed from first class. Camille took one measured step toward the aircraft door before stopping just long enough to look back at Halstead. "Captain," she said, almost gently, "you still have a chance to stop this." He answered without hesitation. "Not happening." Camille gave one final nod and spoke into the call. "Please note the time." Somewhere hundreds of miles away, keyboards immediately began clicking. Back inside Flight 809, nobody noticed the notification that quietly illuminated the screen of Camille's phone. Project North Star, final authorization, $52 billion. 18 minutes earlier, Flight 809 had looked exactly the way every premium international departure was supposed to look. Flight attendants welcomed passengers with polished smiles. Soft jazz drifted through the cabin speakers. Crystal glasses reflected the warm overhead lights while travelers settled into oversized seats designed to promise comfort before the journey had even begun. Dr. Camille Bennett stepped through the aircraft door carrying nothing more than a slim leather portfolio and a small carry-on suitcase. There was no assistant walking behind her, no security detail clearing a path, no designer luggage announcing wealth before she ever spoke. That was intentional. Camille had spent more than 20 years building Bennett Meridian Holdings into one of the most influential investment firms in America, and experience had taught her something that every balance sheet eventually confirmed. People revealed their character most honestly when they believed no one important was watching. Tomorrow morning in Geneva. Her signature would determine whether Bennett Meridian completed the acquisition of North Star Atlantic Airlines through a transaction valued at $52 billion. Lawyers had spent 11 months negotiating the agreement. Investment banks had modeled every scenario imaginable. Regulators on 3 continents had already completed preliminary reviews. Every remaining condition had been satisfied except one: Camille's personal authorization. Without it, the transaction simply would not exist. Only 4 members of North Star Atlantic's executive leadership knew exactly what she looked like. Camille preferred it that way. She wanted one final opportunity to experience the airline exactly as an ordinary customer would. No advance notice. No executive welcome. No carefully rehearsed service. Just the truth. She paused briefly beside seat 1A, comparing the boarding pass in her hand with the seat number beside the window, before placing her portfolio beneath the seat in front of her. A young flight attendant smiled politely as she walked past. Another offered bottled water. Everything felt effortless. For a moment, Camille wondered whether this quiet inspection would end without incident. Across the aisle, however, a distinguished white couple entered the cabin carrying matching luxury travel bags. Charles Waverly glanced toward seat 1A before quietly speaking to the lead flight attendant, Brooke Whitman. His wife remained standing beside him, clearly expecting an accommodation. Brooke listened carefully, then looked toward Camille. Her pleasant expression faded almost instantly. She glanced at Charles again, nodded once, and lowered her voice. Camille could not hear every word, but one sentence carried clearly enough across the cabin. "Leave it to me." Brooke walked confidently toward the forward galley, opened her tablet, and studied the passenger manifest. Her eyes returned to Camille several times before settling on the simple black sweater, the worn sneakers, and the absence of anything that suggested wealth. She never once examined the boarding pass already resting on the armrest. Instead, she approached with the practiced confidence of someone who had already reached a conclusion. "Good afternoon," Brooke said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I am afraid there has been a seating issue." Camille looked up calmly. "Is there?" Brooke folded her tablet against her chest. "I am going to need you to move from this seat." Camille glanced at the boarding pass once more before meeting Brooke's eyes. "According to my ticket," she replied, "I am already exactly where I belong." Brooke remained silent for a moment, then slowly unlocked her tablet, opened the seating chart, rested her finger directly over seat 1A, and without the slightest hesitation pressed a single command that caused Camille Bennett's name to disappear from the screen. Brooke Whitman stared at the screen for less than a second before locking the tablet again, as if the decision had already become fact. "There we are," she said smoothly. "You are no longer assigned to seat 1 Alpha." Camille did not reach for the device or argue about what Brooke had just done. She simply held up the boarding pass that had been scanned successfully less than 5 minutes earlier. "The assignment changed because you changed it," she replied. Brooke gave a thin smile. "The system reflects current information, not opinions." Charles Waverly stepped closer with an expression that suggested the matter had already been settled. "I believe my wife and I were promised seats together," he said. Camille looked at him briefly before answering. "Then your discussion should be with the airline, not with the passenger who paid for this seat." Charles shrugged as though the distinction no longer mattered. Brooke extended one arm toward the main cabin. "There are open seats in economy. I am sure we can find something comfortable." Camille remained seated. "I purchased this seat because I selected it weeks ago. I intend to remain where my ticket places me." The pleasant atmosphere inside the cabin began to disappear one conversation at a time. Nearby passengers lowered magazines. A businessman removed his headphones. Across the aisle, Sarah Mitchell quietly watched every exchange without saying a word. 3 rows behind them, Jamal Brooks frowned as he remembered seeing Camille's boarding pass scan green at the aircraft door only moments earlier. Brooke tapped her radio. "Captain, I need assistance in first class." Less than a minute later, Captain Richard Halstead stepped out of the flight deck with measured confidence. He listened to Brooke for only a few seconds before turning toward Camille. "Ma'am," he said, "my lead flight attendant informs me there is an issue with your seating assignment." Camille handed him the boarding pass. There was not an issue until someone created one. Halstead barely glanced at the document before handing it back. "The current manifest does not show your name in this seat. Perhaps you should ask why it disappeared," Camille answered. Brooke immediately folded her arms. Captain, she has already refused multiple requests to cooperate. Sarah finally spoke from across the aisle. That is not accurate. She has been calm this entire time. Halstead acknowledged neither Sarah nor her statement. His attention never left Camille. Sometimes documents presented on mobile devices or printed at home do not match the live system. Camille slowly reached into her portfolio and produced the original boarding pass issued at the airport counter along with the baggage receipt carrying the same reservation number. Every document matches, she said quietly. Only your screen changed. For the first time, uncertainty crossed the face of a young flight attendant standing near the galley. Emily Carter had personally welcomed Camille aboard and watched the scanner flash green before directing her toward seat 1 Alpha. She looked from Camille to Brooke, then back to the tablet still resting in Brooke's hands. Emily knew exactly what she had seen. Brooke noticed the hesitation immediately. Emily, she said sharply, continue preparing the cabin. Emily nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the passenger manifest. As Brooke turned away for a brief moment, Emily caught a glimpse of the audit icon still glowing in the corner of the screen, indicating that the seating chart had been modified only seconds earlier. Her heartbeat quickened. She understood exactly what that tiny symbol meant. Before she could speak, Captain Halstead reached for his radio once more and delivered a sentence that instantly changed the direction of the afternoon. Ground security, please report to Flight 809. We have a passenger refusing crew instructions. Captain Richard Halstead lowered his radio with the confidence of someone who believed the matter had already been settled. Around him, however, the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin had changed in a way no procedure manual could explain. It was no longer simply a disagreement over a seat. It had become a room full of people quietly measuring fairness against authority. Dr. Camille Bennett remained exactly where she was, her boarding pass resting neatly on her lap, her hands relaxed, her breathing steady. She did not look like someone preparing for a confrontation. She looked like someone allowing every decision to reveal itself. Sarah Mitchell leaned slightly into the aisle. Captain, she said evenly, before security arrives, would it not make sense to review the audit history on the seating chart? Halstead barely acknowledged her. Ma'am, this is an operational matter. Sarah did not raise her voice. It became everyone's matter the moment a passenger with valid documentation was publicly accused. Charles Waverly shifted uncomfortably beside his wife, but remained silent. Jamal Brooks stood from his seat several rows back and spoke clearly enough for half the cabin to hear. I watched her boarding pass scan green at the aircraft door. She never argued with anyone. She walked straight to this seat. Brooke Whitman responded before Halstead could answer. Sir, unless you are part of the crew, I suggest you remain seated. Jamal folded his arms. I am doing exactly what every witness should do. I am telling the truth. For the first time, several passengers nodded in agreement. Emily Carter stood frozen near the forward galley, her heart beating faster with every passing second. She remembered greeting Camille only minutes earlier. She remembered the scanner flashing green. She remembered smiling and saying, Welcome aboard. Seat 1 Alpha is straight ahead. None of those memories matched the version of events now being presented. Brooke glanced toward Emily. Is there a problem? Emily hesitated. Every instinct told her to remain quiet. She was only 6 weeks into training. One complaint from a senior crew member could end the career she had worked years to begin. But another instinct was becoming impossible to ignore. She slowly stepped forward. Captain, she said carefully, I personally scanned her boarding pass. Brooke immediately interrupted. Emily, you must be mistaken. Emily swallowed hard. No, ma'am. The scanner approved it. I remember because first class was almost finished boarding. Brooke's expression hardened. Training crew do not make operational decisions. Emily lowered her eyes for only a moment before looking back at Camille. I am not making a decision, she said quietly. I am describing what happened. A silence settled across the cabin that somehow felt louder than the earlier arguments. Brooke unlocked her tablet again, determined to prove her point, but Emily noticed the audit indicators still glowing beside the seating chart. Without drawing attention to herself, she discreetly opened her own crew device and navigated to the system log. One entry immediately caught her attention. Seat 1 Alpha. Modified. Timestamp. 3 minutes earlier. User credential, Brooke Whitman. Emily felt the air leave her lungs. There it was. Not suspicion. Not memory. A digital record. Before she could decide what to do with what she had found, the aircraft door opened once again. 2 airport security officers stepped inside, and Captain Halstead pointed directly toward Camille Bennett without realizing that the smallest piece of evidence inside Emily's trembling hands had just become the most dangerous document on the airplane. The 2 airport security officers paused just inside the aircraft door, taking in the unusual silence before moving down the aisle. Neither of them rushed. Neither of them appeared angry. They simply followed the request they had received over the radio. Captain Richard Halstead stepped aside and pointed toward Dr. Camille Bennett. "She has refused repeated crew instructions," he said with complete confidence. "We need her removed so we can depart on schedule." One of the officers turned to Camille with a calm expression. "Ma'am, would you be willing to step into the jet bridge with us so we can sort this out?" Camille looked at him without the slightest trace of panic. "Officer, I have presented a valid boarding pass, a matching identification, and every document requested. Before I leave the seat I lawfully purchased, I would appreciate knowing what rule I have actually violated." The officer hesitated. It was a reasonable question. Before he could answer, Brooke Whitman interrupted. "She has been disruptive from the moment we questioned her seating assignment." Sarah Mitchell immediately shook her head. "That is not true. She has remained calm this entire time." Jamal Brooks added. "Everyone in this cabin watched the same conversation. The only people raising their voices have been the crew." The first officer glanced toward his partner. The situation was clearly more complicated than the radio report had suggested. Captain Halstead stepped forward again. "We cannot continue debating this. The aircraft must depart." Camille slowly stood from seat 1 Alpha. She did not resist. She did not argue. As she reached for her small carry-on, the silver bracelet around her wrist slipped loose and quietly fell onto the carpet beside the seat. The tiny sound barely reached anyone else, but it stopped Camille for a single heartbeat. The bracelet was older than her company, older than her first investment, older than every headline that would eventually call her one of the most influential business leaders in America. It had belonged to her mother. For an instant, another airport filled her memory. She was 15 years old again, standing beside her mother at a departure gate in Atlanta. Her mother had carried valid tickets, valid identification, and endless patience. None of it had mattered to the employee who insisted something was wrong. Camille still remembered watching strangers stare while her mother quietly gathered her belongings instead of creating the scene everyone expected. As they walked away that afternoon, her mother had smiled through disappointment and whispered words Camille had carried for nearly 3 decades. "Never let someone else's prejudice decide who you are." The memory disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Camille bent down, picked up the bracelet, fastened it securely around her wrist, and looked directly at Captain Halstead. "The last time someone treated my family this way," she said softly, "we had no voice anyone wanted to hear. Today is different." Halstead folded his arms. "Then cooperate, and this can end peacefully." Camille gave a slow nod. "It will end peacefully," she answered. "Whether it ends wisely is entirely your decision." Emily Carter stood motionless near the galley, her crew device still open in trembling hands. The audit record remained on the screen, showing exactly who had altered seat 1 Alpha and exactly when it happened. She knew that if she stayed silent, an innocent passenger would leave the airplane carrying blame that belonged somewhere else. If she spoke, her career might be over before it truly began. As the security officers prepared to escort Camille toward the aircraft door, Emily took one deep breath, tightened her grip on the device, and finally stepped into the aisle. Emily Carter's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried farther than anyone expected. "Captain," she said, "there is something you need to see before this goes any further." Every pair of eyes shifted toward the young trainee, standing near the forward galley with her crew device clutched tightly in both hands. Brooke Whitman reacted immediately. "Emily, this is not your responsibility." Emily looked at Brooke, then at Captain Richard Halstead, before finding the courage to continue. "The seating audit log records every change made to the passenger manifest. Seat 1 Alpha was modified after Dr. Camille Bennett boarded the aircraft." The cabin fell silent again. Brooke forced a laugh that sounded far less confident than before. "Training records can be misleading. You do not understand how the system works." Emily swallowed hard, but did not lower the device. I understand enough to read a timestamp. Captain Halstead extended his hand. Let me see it. Brooke stepped forward first. Captain, that information is incomplete. Camille watched the exchange without interrupting. She had spent decades sitting in boardrooms where people often revealed more by trying to hide evidence than by confronting it. The first security officer looked from Brooke to Emily and quietly said, Captain, perhaps we should review the information before asking the passenger to leave. Halstead hesitated for only a moment before shaking his head. Operational decisions belong to the flight crew. We are proceeding. Emily's shoulders dropped slightly. She had expected resistance, but not a refusal to even look at the evidence. Jamal Brooks took one step into the aisle. You are refusing proof because it does not support the story you already decided to believe. Sarah Mitchell nodded. That decision may become very important later. Brooke crossed her arms again. Enough. We have delayed this flight long enough. Camille calmly reached for her phone. The first security officer instinctively glanced toward Halstead, who answered with a short nod. Let her make one call, the captain said. 30 seconds. That changes nothing. Camille unlocked the screen and selected a single contact without scrolling. The call connected almost instantly. Natalie, she said in the same composed tone she had used from the beginning. Activate Clause 7. Suspend Project North Star immediately. There was no surprise on the other end. Natalie Reed answered as though she had been expecting the call. Confirmed. Do I also notify the board that executive authorization has been withdrawn? Camille looked directly at Captain Halstead. Yes. Freeze every signature. Preserve every digital record associated with Flight 809, including passenger manifest revisions, crew communications, and audit logs. Nothing is to be altered. Understood, Natalie replied. The board is already assembled. Legal, compliance, and the transaction committee are now joining the call. Camille ended the conversation and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Brooke smirked as though she had just witnessed an empty performance. That was dramatic, she said. Are we finished now? Camille met her eyes with quiet certainty. No. We have only reached the point where your decisions begin having consequences. At that exact moment, Emily quietly pressed the send button on her crew device. The audit log showing the alteration of Seat 1 Alpha left the airplane and arrived in the inbox of Bennett Meridian Holdings legal department. Less than 5 seconds later, thousands of miles away, a conference room screen displaying the words Final Authorization turned bright red as a new status appeared across the top in bold letters. Transaction suspended by executive order. The first sign that something had changed did not come from anyone inside the cabin. It came from the sharp tone of Captain Richard Halstead's company phone vibrating against his belt. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and answered without stepping away. Halstead speaking. His confident posture began to fade almost immediately. Yes, sir. We have a passenger issue, but it is under control. He listened for several seconds before the color drained from his face. I was not informed she was on board. Across the aisle, Brooke Whitman felt her own tablet vibrate repeatedly. One notification followed another until the display filled with flashing priority alerts. Executive hold. Corporate review. Do not depart. She stared at the messages without understanding why they were arriving all at once. Camille Bennett remained perfectly still. She neither smiled nor celebrated. She simply waited. Captain Halstead slowly lowered the phone from his ear before looking directly at Camille for the first time that afternoon, not as a difficult passenger, but as someone he suddenly realized he should have recognized much sooner. Dr. Bennett, he said quietly, may I speak with you for a moment? Camille tilted her head slightly. Captain, we have been speaking for quite some time. Nobody inside the cabin moved. Even the security officers remained where they were, sensing that the situation had shifted beyond anything they had been called to handle. Halstead swallowed hard. Corporate has requested that we resolve this immediately. Camille answered with complete calm. Corporate had that opportunity before your crew decided facts were less important than assumptions. Brooke stepped forward, her confidence now replaced by confusion. Who exactly are you? Camille looked toward the front of the aircraft before answering. My name is Dr. Camille Bennett. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Bennett Meridian Holdings. Several passengers exchanged puzzled looks, but Sarah Mitchell's expression changed instantly. She recognized the name from financial news. Jamal Brooks whispered softly, "No way." Camille continued without raising her voice. "For the past 11 months, my company has led the investment group negotiating the acquisition of North Star Atlantic Airlines." Silence settled over the cabin once again. "The transaction you were expecting to close tomorrow morning carries a value of $52 billion. Until a few minutes ago, my signature was the final authorization required to complete it." Brooks' tablet emitted another warning tone. This time the message was impossible to misunderstand. "Transaction suspended. Executive authorization withdrawn." Captain Halstead closed his eyes for a brief moment. "Dr. Bennett, if we had known." Camille gently interrupted him. "That is precisely the problem, Captain. You did not need to know who I was. You only needed to treat me with the same fairness you would have shown any other passenger holding a valid ticket." Her words landed harder than any accusation could have. Sarah slowly nodded. Jamal folded his arms in quiet agreement. Even the first security officer looked toward the floor. Brooke attempted one final defense. "We were following procedure." Camille met her eyes. "No. Procedure would have required reviewing the audit log. Procedure would have required verifying the boarding record. What happened instead was a decision based on what you believed someone who looked like me could not possibly be." At that exact moment, the aircraft intercom chimed unexpectedly. A gate supervisor's voice filled the cabin. "Captain Halstead, you are instructed to remain at the gate. Members of the executive leadership team are on their way to the aircraft, and they have asked that no one leave until they arrive." No one spoke after the announcement. The silence inside the cabin felt heavier than the engines waiting beneath the wings. Captain Richard Halstead slowly lowered the intercom handset, as though it suddenly weighed far more than it had a minute earlier. Brooke Whitman stared at the warning messages still covering her tablet. Every attempt to access the passenger manifest now returned the same notice. "Records locked for corporate review." She tapped the screen again, then again, hoping the message would disappear. It did not. Dr. Camille Bennett quietly returned to seat 1 Alpha and placed her portfolio beside her without asking permission. She acted exactly as she had from the moment she boarded the aircraft. Calm, patient, completely certain of who she was. The first security officer stepped back into the jet bridge and quietly informed the second officer, "We are finished here." Neither officer attempted to question Camille again. Sarah Mitchell watched them leave before turning toward Captain Halstead. "That was all this needed from the beginning," she said. "A willingness to examine the facts." Jamal Brooks nodded. Instead, everyone was expected to believe assumptions. Brooke looked toward Camille with uncertainty replacing authority. "Dr. Bennett, I did not realize." Camille answered before the sentence could continue. "You have repeated those words twice already. They do not change what happened." Brooke lowered her eyes. For the first time that afternoon, she had no prepared response. Emily Carter walked slowly toward Camille, still holding the crew device that contained the audit log. "Dr. Bennett," she said quietly, "I sent the record before anyone could remove it." Camille accepted the information with a grateful smile. "You protected the truth, Emily. That takes more courage than protecting a reputation." Emily felt her shoulders relax for the first time since boarding had begun. Across the cabin, several passengers quietly applauded. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was simply the natural response of people who had watched honesty survive pressure. Moments later, the aircraft door opened once again. This time, 3 senior executives from North Star Atlantic entered the cabin accompanied by members of the airline's legal department. Leading the group was Thomas Grayson, the company's interim chief executive officer. His expression revealed that he already knew far more than anyone inside the aircraft wanted him to know. He walked directly toward Camille before stopping beside seat 1 Alpha. "Dr. Bennett," he said respectfully, "on behalf of North Star Atlantic, I sincerely apologize for what occurred today." Camille remained seated. "Your apology is addressed to the right person," she replied, "but it is arriving because of my title instead of your principles." Thomas lowered his head. "You are correct." He then turned toward Captain Halstead and Brooke Whitman. "Effective immediately, both of you are relieved of duty pending an independent investigation. Your company credentials, flight authority, and system access have already been suspended." Brooke's tablet suddenly went dark. Captain Halstead removed the company phone from his belt. Neither device belonged to them anymore. Thomas looked back at Camille. The board is asking whether Bennett Meridian will reconsider completing tomorrow's acquisition. Camille folded her hands together and allowed several quiet seconds to pass before answering. That depends on whether your company wants to repair its public image or repair its culture. No one inside the cabin could answer that question. Then Thomas's own phone rang. He listened silently for several seconds before looking back toward Camille with an expression that suggested the consequences had only just begun. Dr. Bennett, he said carefully, the board has unanimously agreed to every condition you requested before we even had the opportunity to ask what those conditions are. Thomas Grayson slowly placed his phone back into his pocket, but the weight of the conversation remained visible on his face. Every executive standing behind him understood that this was no longer about saving a transaction. It was about deciding whether the company deserved another chance. Dr. Camille Bennett stood from seat 1 Alpha and looked around the cabin one final time. The same passengers who had witnessed suspicion, assumptions, and quiet humiliation were now witnessing something entirely different. Accountability. She turned toward Thomas and spoke with the calm confidence that had never left her voice. If Bennett Meridian completes this acquisition, it will not happen because your financial projections are attractive. It will happen because your company proves it is willing to become better than it was this morning. Thomas nodded. Tell us what must change. Camille answered without hesitation. An independent review of every discrimination complaint filed during the last 5 years. A permanent passenger rights council that reports directly to the board of directors. Mandatory leadership training focused on fair treatment instead of appearances. Protection for every employee who reports misconduct in good faith. And complete transparency with the public about today's investigation. No one argued. No one negotiated. Thomas simply replied, every condition will be accepted. Camille looked toward Emily Carter, who still held the small crew device that had preserved the audit record before it could disappear. Emily, she said, today you had every reason to stay silent and every opportunity to protect yourself. Instead, you protected the truth. Companies become stronger because of people like you. Emily smiled through grateful tears and quietly answered, I only told the truth. Camille shook her head gently. The truth is easy to recognize. Speaking it when your future feels uncertain is what requires courage. Jamal Brooks smiled from several rows back, while Sarah Mitchell quietly gathered her briefcase. Neither of them had known Camille before boarding that airplane, yet both understood they had witnessed something much larger than one disagreement over a seat assignment. Captain Richard Halstead and Brooke Whitman stood silently near the aircraft door, no longer surrounded by authority, only by the consequences of decisions they could not undo. Camille looked at them with neither anger nor satisfaction. This was never about revenge, she said. The greatest cost of prejudice is not what it takes from the person standing in front of you. It is what it destroys inside the institution that allows it to exist. Those words settled over the cabin with more force than any raised voice ever could. Thomas extended his hand. Dr. Bennett, if you are still willing, we would be honored to welcome you aboard this flight. Camille accepted the gesture with quiet dignity before returning to seat 1 Alpha, the seat that had belonged to her from the very beginning. Outside the aircraft, a new flight crew completed final preparations while the investigation officially began. Hours later, Bennett Meridian announced that the acquisition would remain suspended until every promised reform had been independently verified. News of the decision spread across financial markets, not because a company had lost access to $52 billion, but because one leader had demonstrated that integrity carried greater value than any balance sheet. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, Camille looked once at the silver bracelet resting on her wrist and remembered her mother's words from so many years before. Never let someone else's prejudice decide who you are. She smiled softly toward the window as the runway lights stretched into the distance. They had tried to remove a passenger they believed did not belong in first class. Instead, they revealed exactly why she belonged at the head of every table where the future would be decided. True leadership was never measured by wealth, titles, or power. It was measured by the courage to raise the standard without ever needing to. Raise your voice.